to the Robert L. Harris Memorial Lecture. This is the central event of our semester. And before I have the pleasure of introducing you to Professor James Waller and his lecture on becoming evil, I need to introduce you to our beloved president of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide, Christine Davidian, who will tell you something about this organization. The organization that sponsors this lecture and does a lot more for this university and the community. And she will also be telling you about a number of the prestigious members of the Alliance who are with us and who have passed away in this past year. So please welcome Christine Davidian.
Everybody to the Robert L. Harris Memorial Lecture. As the current president of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide, it's an honor to be introducing Robert L. Harris Memorial Lecture and providing a background on Robert L. Harris and the community group that this supports this unique course. Robert L. Harris was a World War II veteran who had retired and moved with his wife Claire to Sonoma County after a distinguished career in teaching and administration, which included directing a school for troubled youth. Mr. Harris became active in the Jewish community and decided that a contribution he could make was to ensure that all students at all levels were educated about the Holocaust. He became involved in the annual Yom HaShoah, which evolved from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising remembrance held for years by a group in Petaluma. At the 1983 Yom HaShoah coordinated by Mr. Harris, and held at Sonoma State Commons, which is probably not even here today. Maybe it is. Yeah. Keynote speaker, SSU President Peter I've been practicing this. Diamatopoulos challenged Robert to do more than just memorialize the Holocaust annually. With Professor Steiner, a Holocaust survivor and professor of sociology, already teaching classes that dealt with the Holocaust issues, Paul Banco, also a Holocaust survivor and faculty member in the biology department, and George Jackson, a liberator and faculty member in the psychology department at SSU, it became apparent that SSU was an ideal place for a permanent program about the Holocaust. So in that spring of 1983, Robert Harris asked a number of community members as well to assist him in responding to the president's challenge. They included Joel Newberg, who was working at the Holocaust Library and Research Center in San Francisco in 1978 by survivors, Sylvia Zucker, a retired teacher and volunteer with Hadassah, Virgil Miller, one of Professor Steiner's first students and a Warsaw Ghetto Memorial attendee, Evelyn Evie Sackler, another of Professor Steiner's students, Eugene Kravitz, Irv Newman, and another local survivor, Walter Kuttner. He also invited ministers and rabbis. Sylvia Zucker remembers Robert Harris as an indefatigable leader with enormous determination who was also able to work with all types of people and an inspiration. As Joel Newberg recalls, Robert was a one-person organization. He knew what needed to be done, how to interface with individuals and groups, and how to handle all the fundraising. He simply would ask and people would donate. Thus began this special university community partnership, and the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust was formed in 1983 on behalf of the victims and survivors of the Holocaust, with their desire to tell their stories and learn from their experiences. Those who began this collaborative effort between the community and the members of Sonoma State University faculty promised to let the world know of the atrocities that had occurred and never forget. This Holocaust and Genocide lecture series is now in its 32nd year and has grown from 5 to 6 lectures a year into this course that currently enrolls 125 students annually. Professor Steiner became the first director of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust, and then Professor Myrna Goodman, seated there, who was a returning student working toward her bachelor's degree and the first student assistant hired by the center. Almost from its inception, the series had included lectures on other genocides as well as the Holocaust. The Alliance board today includes members of the community, university faculty, administrators, and students who have actually participated in this lecture series class. Its current mission is to co-sponsor the lecture series, support the center in providing programming to the larger community, including secondary education school teachers, and to collaborate with other community groups working with issues related to the Holocaust and Genocide. In 2010, the name of the Alliance was changed to the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide to reflect its continuing education and commitment to include all those affected by genocide. After Robert's death, the members of the Alliance decided to name an annual lecture in the series as a tribute to his unswerving dedication and commitment to Holocaust education. We are all truly indebted to Robert for his vision and his leadership. And something we've been doing on an annual basis during the Harris Lecture is to spend time and honor those people in memoriam who passed away this past year, notably our Holocaust survivors and supporters of the program. So, and as you see, here's Robert Harris right there. And unfortunately, this year we had so many, there's no way we can read the bios for all of them. So what we're going to do briefly is you all should have received a handout that has the bio for all the people that I cannot speak directly about today at this podium. So please take time to read it. Their lives are so amazing, and it is worth to take a couple minutes of your time to read their bios. So if you will go to the next screen, you'll see in memoriam this year was Hildy Katz, who survived the kinder transport to England. Olaf Dieter survived Blankenberg forced labor camp near Buchenwald. Werner Epstein survived the other kinder transport to Belgium and France. And again, there's a lot more detail in these bios. George Farber, who was a longtime lecture series supporter. And Sophie Rosalie Fox survived by working in hiding in Amsterdam, and unfortunately we didn't have her picture, but there's her home place right there. Estelle Klipp survived Auschwitz, Sachsen, Bergen-Belsen concentration camps, and Dr. John M. Steiner, who was the first center. And what I'm going to do today is read more about Dr. Steiner. Always surviving for deeper, meaningful human connection, Dr. John Steiner was unwilling to settle for superficiality. He was defined by the ordeal of surviving Nazi camps during the Holocaust in his teenage years, losing his mother and nearly all of his family. Driven by humanistic principles and a long life urge to understand in order not to hate, John Steiner's story is unique in that he tracked down and interviewed many former perpetrators in West Germany. Transgressing academic disciplines, he studied and taught for several decades at Sonoma State University, and as the founding director of its Holocaust Studies Center. Born in Prague in August 3, 1925, John Steiner grew up in a German-speaking middle-class family. Following the communist rise to power in Czechoslovakia in 1948, he emigrated to Australia, but left his new home behind to receive a scholarship in MA from the University of Missouri, where he majored in German literature and sociology before moving to Berkeley and to lecture at the University of California. The cornerstone of John's later career was laid by a fellowship from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, by means of which he came to Germany to begin his research on the perpetrators of the Holocaust, graduating in 1968 with a Ph.D. in sociology from the University of Freiburg. It was also there that he met his wife, Ulrike. John Steiner returned to the Bay Area as a professor at Sonoma State University, moving to Nevada in 1974. Over the years, he touched countless students, many of whom were deeply influenced by his classes. Even after his retirement in 1992, he continued his research, publishing and lecturing to a wide range of audiences, both in the US and Germany. His many distinctions included 2 Fulbright scholarships and the Order of Merit from the Federal Republic of Germany. To the very end, he toiled to avert future fascism and genocide by educating on the lessons of Holocaust. He did what he could. John survived the Riesenstahl, Augsburg, Dachau, and other concentration camps. He endured the horrendous ride in a cattle wagon to Auschwitz and the death march at the end of the war. He lost his toes during the bitter cold. Dr. Steiner often advises students to develop a profile in courage. If we don't do what we believe, cruelty to people will persist. He would also add, now that you have learned about the Holocaust act and make certain that nothing like this has ever happened again. And I just want to say thank you. And there was one more slide after this that is for this year's Yom HaShoah commemoration on April 19th. Thank you very much.
Professor Waller is the Cohen Chair of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College in New Hampshire. He has held fellowships with the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies in Washington, D.C., and he is a continuing instructor with the Raphael Lemkin Seminar for Genocide Prevention and the Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation. Dr. Waller grew up in Atlanta at the height of the Civil Rights Movement. And very early on, he questioned the social divisions and racism in the society around him. His graduate work at the University of Kentucky and his first books were on topics of racism and prejudice in America. Before moving to Keene University, Dr. Waller was a professor of social psychology at Whitworth University in Spokane. Professor Waller has been a pillar of this lecture series for many years. His study of becoming evil is a modern classic, and it is the critical analysis for this course. His depiction of the insidious cycle of genocide demands our attention and alerts us to how a seemingly inconsequential series of events can snowball into genocide. At the heart of his study is the most essential question that we can ask of genocide studies. Why do we become evil? And so, fresh from Sarajevo, I bring you Professor Tom.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Diane, and thank you for being here. I'm always happy to be here at Sonoma State. I'm really happy this time for three reasons. One is, as Diane said, I've been for the past week and a half in Sarajevo, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and because of schedules and conflicts, I had to leave Bosnia on Monday. So yesterday, I think at about this time, I landed in Boston Logan Airport from Sarajevo, and my plane was delayed because of landing gear issues at the beginning, and usually I get frustrated with plane delays, but I kind of need the landing gear stuff to work, I figure, at some point. So landed, it was delayed. I had 40 minutes from the time I got off that plane to get through customs, get my luggage, meet my wife, hop on a plane to come here to San Francisco. And I was absolutely sure there's no way I was going to make it. And I was already thinking, how am I going to break this to Diane? Because I can't make this plane, but made it. So very, very glad to be here. Very, very tired. So after this, I may be, by like 5 o'clock, I may be nodding off. So hopefully you can stay with me. Second thing is great about being here is it's great to see grass that's green. New England, if you've heard, as Diane mentioned, I'm at Keene State College in Keene, New Hampshire, and we've had over 120 inches of snow this winter. It all seemed like it came at one time, but I haven't seen grass in months. So to be here and see the green of the grass is just incredible. And a third reason is always the same reason. It's just an honor to be here with you at Sonoma State. The distinction of Keene State College is that we're the only undergraduate school in the United States to offer an undergraduate major in Holocaust and Genocide studies. So we have about 50 students who are at our college focusing their undergraduate career on topics that you're studying in this course related to the Holocaust and Genocide. But Keene State is a sister institution of Sonoma State. We're both members of the Council of Public Liberal Arts Colleges, so there are so many similarities between what you do here at Sonoma State and what we do at Keene State. But your distinction here, I think, is, and always has been for over 30 years, this lecture series. I have the chance to lecture on several college university campuses over the course of the year, and there is simply nothing like what you do here. The course that you do, and then the chance you have to come together once a week and hear from a wide range of people, both at your home institution of Sonoma State, but also the other scholars and experts that Diane brings in, and before her, my good friend Myrna Goodman brought in as well. So I love coming here because simply there's no other program like this. You're the most educated audience I speak to off campus, and it's always great to have a chance to be here with you for this. So what we'll do today, as Diane mentioned in the introduction, is look at this question of becoming evil, how ordinary people commit genocide and mass killing. This is a result of work I've been doing for close to 20 years now that was first published in 2002 in Becoming Evil, and since then a second edition in 2007 and a third edition that'll be out in another year and a half or so. It was very nice in the introduction, and Diane said this is a modern classic, and I kind of have to smile because someone brought down at the beginning of class a first edition copy of the book. Nick, where's Nick? Yeah, Nick there. Bought a first edition copy of the book, so he's been having a hard time following along in class because he's in the wrong edition, but he brought it down to show me, and it was a book that evidently at some point I had signed in 2002, and I had said in the inscription, Brad, with much appreciation for all the great work you do, September 30th, 2002, Jim Waller. So Brad didn't think this was a modern classic, it's clear. And I'm kind of torqued off at Brad right now, and I don't like any of the work that Brad does. I don't know who he is, I don't remember, but if Brad were here, I think I'd be angry. So, we're going to look at this question. How do ordinary people become capable of committing genocide and mass killing? A lot of ways we could enter this discussion, but let's do it this way with the story of a woman that I've had the chance to interview in Rwanda. Much of the work I've done, particularly for the second edition, I did by interviewing a couple of hundred perpetrators in Rwanda, Argentina, Guatemala, and the former Yugoslavia, specifically in Serbia and Republic Srpska, which is part of the reason I was in Sarajevo the last week and a half. With those, I've had the chance to interview survivors, because very often some of the best information I've found about people understanding how ordinary people come to do this comes from survivors who in many cases knew the identity and knew the person, the perpetrator, even before the killing started. And I should say here, especially because of the introduction, that part of my work for a long time has relied upon the work of John Steiner. So even before I started coming here to Sonoma State and spending this time with you every spring, my work and life has intersected with Sonoma State through the work and life of John Steiner. But let me tell you about this one woman in Rwanda I had the chance to interview. You've studied a little bit about Rwanda yet? My good friend, Ambassador Mukantadame, will be here coming soon, 2 weeks from today, I think. So, in Rwanda, in 1959 to 1962, when Hutu extremists first attacked Tutsi minority in Rwanda, Tutsi husbands and fathers said to their sons, their daughters, their wives, their mothers, go to the church because you'll be safe in the church. The Hutus won't violate the church. And in 59 to 62, that was correct. Tutsi women and children, elderly people fled to the churches, fled to the mission compounds, and they were safe. Hutu extremists didn't cross that boundary and kill in those particular massacres. In 1994, when President Habyarimana's plane was shot down on April 6th, and Tutsis knew that something was now triggered that was going to be targeted at them, Tutsi husbands and fathers again said to their wives, their children, their mothers, their fathers, go to the church. You'll be safe in the church, just like you were safe 30 years ago. So thousands of Tutsi Rwandans fled to the churches and mission compounds, but 1994 was going to be different. The Hutu extremists were going to implement their own final solution. They weren't going to stop at anything in 94. They were going to exterminate every single Tutsi they could get their hands on, and unfortunately, because of what they had experienced in 62, many Tutsi, thousands of Tutsi, rounded themselves up in these churches, in these mission compounds, and the perpetrators knew where to find them. Perpetrators didn't have to track them down. The perpetrators came to the churches and mission compounds. They lobbed hand grenades at the gates or at the windows. They broke into the churches, and they killed. They shot, they hacked, they clubbed people to death, And still today, if you visit Rwanda, these churches are places of memory. When I first went to Rwanda a few years after the genocide, the bones of the victims laid where they had fallen during the genocide. You didn't have to look hard. You could look from a distance of several feet, and you could see on the forearm bones the machete marks where victims had tried to fend off the machete. You could see the bullet wounds in the skulls of victims. Today, most of those bones have been either taken by families and buried. Some of them left as part of the memorial, but stacked neatly in some corner, and the clothes still lie there. One of the famous massacres occurred at a church called Intirama, about 30 minutes outside the capital city of Kigali. At this church, we can conservatively estimate that 3,000 Tutsi were slaughtered, maybe as many as 5,000 to 6,000. One of the women I interviewed was a survivor of Intirama. She was in the church when the Hutu extremists broke through the gates. They lobbed a hand grenade in. She was dazed. She was concussed. She was wounded trying to escape. She was hit by machete, wounded trying to escape. She crawled out the back window, and she found her way to a little brick building behind the church, which was a small building where children went on Sunday for Sunday school, for Christian education behind the church. Behind this small building, she lay for about a day and a half. She was again confused from a concussion. She was dazed. She was wounded. She drifted into and out of consciousness. But when she was awake, she recalled very vividly hearing a sound. A few seconds would pass. She'd hear it again. A few seconds would pass. She'd hear it again. And as long as she was awake, she heard every few seconds this sound coming from within this small building that she couldn't trace. She had no idea what the sound was. This is the room of the building behind which this woman lay for a day and a half. Today, if you visit this room, it's a little hard to make out here, but if you look in the upper left-hand corner, you see a large blood stain on the wall. This blood stain is still there. It's over 20 years later. Hasn't been preserved, hasn't been added to, but what this woman was hearing on a regular basis in the day and a half she was behind this room was the sound of children being picked up by the feet and being swung headfirst against this wall. It happened so long and so often that the blood in this wall still is there. It's still part of this memorial. The place where this children had come to worship, the place where this children had come for religious education was turned into a place of destruction. And she heard for a day and a half this constant killing. So the question we're faced with here for the next hour is, who does something like this? Who's the person picking up the children and killing them in this way? Understand, this is not unique to Rwanda. Native American cavalry troops killed American Indian children in this way, bashing them headfirst against walls and the sides of wagons. We have the same type of killing of children in the Holocaust. In Armenia, if you visit Cambodia, they have memorial trees in memory of children who were beaten against those trees, beaten to death. So this actually isn't that unusual in terms of a method of destruction against children in Rwanda. But if we ask the question, who does something like this, the easiest answer, the safest answer you could give would be what? How would you describe a person like this that's just the safest, easiest thing for us to pinpoint? I'm sorry? Psychotic, evil, demonic, an animal. All of these things keep this person at a distance. What's the most uncomfortable thing to say about this person? Yes? Yeah, the most uncomfortable thing is maybe they're not that unusual. Maybe they're fairly similar to you and I. Now let me finish this part of the story before we move on. This is one of those odd research coincidences where I've had a chance to interview the survivor who overheard this, and I've had a chance on 2 different occasions to interview the man who was doing the killing. the man who was swinging these children headfirst against the wall. Again, it'd be easiest if I could tell you that man was an animal, he was evil, he's demonic, he's a lunatic. Everyone in the village knew this man was trouble from birth on. This man was anything but that. He was a member of this church where the killing took place, an active member of this Catholic Church. He was a wonderful father by all accounts, a very loyal and loving husband by all accounts, a wonderful son by all accounts. And here's the hardest thing about this person. What was his occupation in this village? He was a school teacher. He taught the equivalent of elementary school, and many of the children he killed in this room were his students. A Christian man, father, his own children, a teacher of students, and he's the one doing this killing. I think this story I start with because I think it's very indicative of most of the perpetrators of genocide and mass atrocity that we come face to face with. So our question here over the course of our time together is, who is this person and how did he come to carry out these type of atrocities? This is an important question because, as you know, Rwanda is unfortunately not the only case of genocide from the 20th century. Scholars in the field call the 20th century the age of genocide, beginning with the destruction of a native Herero African population in Southwest Africa, present-day Namibia, in 1904, coming on the heels of the physical and cultural destruction of Native Americans in the U.S. and First Nations people in Canada, followed by the murder of 1.5 million Armenians by Turks between 1915 and 1923. As you probably already know, a genocide which this year we'll remember for its 100th anniversary commemoration, but a genocide which Turkey still denies. And just having come from Bosnia and Herzegovina, I can tell you a genocide which most people in Bosnia also deny, because Bosnia has very close ties, enjoys close ties to Turkey. So not everyone in the world has certainly recognized or admitted this genocide. Soviet man-made famine in the Ukraine in 32, 33. The Holocaust of 1939 to 45, where 2 out of every 3 of Europe's Jews were killed by Hitler's regime. And at the end of the Holocaust, at the liberation of the Buchenwald concentration camp, there's an image of a prisoner in the camp who is holding up a sign that, when translated, translates as never again. Never again is really the rallying cry in genocide prevention. And we want to believe that after the Holocaust, never again would we see something like this happen. But never again, as one journalist says, only has meaning if by it you mean never again would Germans kill Jews in Europe in the 1940s. If that's what never again means, it's spot on. If never again means never again would we see anything like this, nothing could be farther from the truth. I have a friend who's fond of saying, it's really not never again, it's just here we go again, and here we go again, and here we go again. And indeed, since the Holocaust, we have seen this. Thanks. In Indonesia, Bangladesh, Burundi, Cambodia, East Timor, Argentina, Guatemala, Sri Lanka, Iraq, Rwanda, Bosnia, Nepal, Darfur. Today, concern in Burma, Central African Republic, the world's newest country of South Sudan. It really does seem like here we go again and again and again. Conservatively, if you add up the death toll genocide has caused in the 20th century, you're looking conservatively at 60 million victims. Some people estimate as high as 170. I think probably our best estimate is somewhere around 100 million people who died because their government said, you're no longer worthy of living. Not because some other oppositional group said it, not because of a natural disaster, not because of a disease, but because the government entrusted with your protection said, we don't even want you living among us, we just don't want you living, period. One of the things we have to keep in mind in genocide studies is the numbers are huge. 6 million Jewish dead, 800,000 Rwandans, over 8,000 people killed at Srebrenica. Numbers are huge, but we never start at the end of those. We have to start at the beginning. and we say there's one victim here, there's a second, there's a third, there's a fourth, and that's what builds up to those massive numbers. Every one of those victims loved someone, was loved by someone else, had hopes, dreams, and aspirations that would never be fulfilled. Many of them never got to go to university like you did because they didn't live long enough to be able to do that. And in the wake of those victims, we also recognize that the survivors carry a weight, carry a legacy of it as well. So, I think over the course of time, I'm really beginning to become very focused on the reality that you never measure the toll of genocide simply in the number of dead. That's what we typically think of it as. But you have to measure it in its impact upon the living. And even if you want to be very crass about it, in its economic destruction. I read something on the plane over that said Syria, in the midst of its fourth year of a civil war, has set itself back economically, socially, and politically 35 years. So it's going to take Syria, if this war ever ends, 35 years to get to the point that they should be at today if they had a functioning, stable society. Last week in Sarajevo, I had dinner with one of the people who participate in our program, Hasan Nuhanovic. If you ever have a chance to see a movie called Srebrenica, Cry from the Grave, Hasan Nuhanovic was the UN translator at Srebrenica, the Potocari Dutch Battalion headquarters, whose parents and brother were at Srebrenica, and because Hasan was a negotiator, a translator for the UN, he thought he could protect his parents and his brother. He couldn't. The UN said they can't stay, and his father had to say to him, Hasan, you may be all we have left. You stay, I'll take care of my wife and my son. He couldn't do that. Hasan's mother and father died as victims at Srebrenica. His mother was actually one of the relatively few female victims at Srebrenica, and his brother died. This is 20 years later, 1995 till today. Hasan's still wrecked by this. He just 2 years ago, I believe, won a decision, a legal decision from a Dutch court because he sued the Dutch troops of the UN who forced his parents and his brother out of the camp. He sued them for negligence. And a Dutch court said, you're right, our troops should never have sent them away. But Hasan just told me that it was only last year that they finally found the remains of his brother. They found the remains of his mother and father, I believe, 3 years ago. Only last year they found the remains of his brother. And you speak with Hasan, or if Hasan were here today, you would say about him what another friend of mine says about him is he's stuck. He's stuck in hatred. He's stuck in anger. He's stuck in loss. And you can't blame him. But when I had dinner with Hasan last week, it was one of those other incredible reminders that you don't just take the toll of genocide on the dead. The toll of genocide has an impact on those who live, those who survive, the grandchildren of people who have been lost, related to people who have been lost, for instance, in the Holocaust. It takes a toll on them as well. So what we want to look at, I'm not sure this is working, Andrew, thanks, is that our general principle that my research follows from is this, that when groups come to power, political, social, religious groups come to power, and they want to commit genocide or mass atrocity, war crimes, crimes against humanity, they do. They have a lot of obstacles they have to overcome to do it, but most often they're able to do it. Let's think together for a moment, if you're part of a regime that's come to power and you want to commit mass atrocity, large-scale mass murder, including genocide, what things might stop you from doing it? Stephanie? It's like 150 people in here. No one's named Stephanie. That's like a statistical improbability. Stephanie, there's probably a Stephanie in here sitting here going, oh my God, he just called my name. Ideas. What can stop you from committing genocide if you wanted to? Yes? Legal frameworks. Maybe your country has a law against it. The world does have a law against it. It's called the Genocide Convention, so maybe you might be stopped by a legal convention or framework, although it doesn't seem to matter to a lot of people who want to kill. What else? A revolt of some type, revolt in the army, a revolt from your citizens who may stand up and say, I don't care how you feel about this group of people, we can't kill them, we can't do this. Yes? Yeah, the international world may step in and say, you know, you can't do what you want to your own people. I mean, we know you're not bothering another state, it's not an act of war, but you can't kill civilian populations like this. Yes? It could be economic issues that could be at play here. And these are great. These are all things that could stop you from killing. Even the logistics of it. What do you do with bodies? In Rwanda, people will tell you at the height of the genocide, late April, early May 1994, the Kagera River ran from Rwanda into Uganda, into Lake Victoria, the world's second largest freshwater lake. Survivors of the genocide will tell you that at the height of the killing, you could walk across this pretty wide river on the bodies of people who were floating down it, the bloated bodies. I mean, that's how many people were floating down, and Uganda declared a health crisis because there's so many decaying corpses flowing into Lake Victoria that it was affecting the fishing industries in the villages there. So logistic issues of what do you do with the bodies of people who die here, all of these things can be obstacles. But the one thing that turns out not to be an obstacle is we've never had a regime in history want to commit genocide or mass murder and have to throw up its hands and say, as much as we'd love to kill this group of people, we can't find the people to do the killing. They can always find the people to do the killing. They never have to worry about that. So our question becomes, in the midst of this reality, we have two research questions that flow from it. And the first is, how many people does it take to carry out genocide and mass killing? If regimes can always find these killers, how many people are we talking about? When I ask my classes at Keene State this question the first day of class, and they think of the Holocaust, which they know the best, and they say, well, it's a Hitler, it's a Himmler, it's a Goering, it's a Goebbels, and I stop there and I say, no, the people you've mentioned are architects of genocide. They're morally and legally responsible for the policies they make, but none of the people you mentioned actually killed anyone, actually bloodied their hands with the hard work of killing. I'm talking about the rank and file. How many people at the front lines, pulling triggers, swinging machete, in Rwanda swinging masu, the baseball clubs-like clubs with nails driven through them so they protrude from the other side? How many of those people are we talking about? This number we don't have much of an idea of. Why? Who do we tend to go after in justice? International tribunals. Who do we go after? Architects. Yes? Yeah, architects. We want to bring the architects to justice, as we should. We want to bring some pretty notorious perpetrators, kind of big fish, we'll try to bring to justice. But by and large, the people who commit these atrocities, we're not ever going to bring to justice. One of the things I often say about this is that genocide overwhelms justice. Genocide is such a societal tsunami that justice can't keep up with it. Again, we go back to Rwanda. When the genocide ended in July 1994, if Rwanda had wanted to start prosecutions of perpetrators, there were 7 judges and lawyers left alive in Rwanda. You can't do it. You don't have the judicial system to bring these people to justice. The world steps in and tries to do it. We've had an international tribunal for Rwanda that's now in its 21st year. I think its final number of indictments were 96 people. 96 people the international tribunal has brought to justice. Rwanda has developed a national system that's done incredible in pursuit of justice of perpetrators, but estimates in Rwanda, 260,000 to 270,000 people involved in actual killing. Rwanda is a country the size of Vermont. This isn't a big country in Central Africa. The Holocaust, we estimate maybe 500,000. Germans, Latvians, Lithuanians, Croats, Poles, Ukrainians involved in the slaughter of 6 million Jews. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, someone I was just talking to last week said in Srebrenica, they estimate that probably about 27,000 Serbs were involved as killers, drivers, diggers, cooks in the slaughter at Srebrenica. Probably easily 5,000 to 7,000 of them actually did the work of face-to-face killing of over 8,000 Muslim men, boys, and some women in that particular case of genocide. So we can make estimates, and our estimates will tell us that for genocide to be successful from the perspective of the perpetrator group, you have to have thousands of people involved at the front lines here. And our second question is, who are these people? How are they enlisted to perpetrate such extraordinary evil? I'm very sorry that my friend Chris Browning wasn't able to join you earlier this semester. I just found that out, that Chris had a health issue that kept him from coming to join you. But Chris has been very important in my career and my work. And in 1992, Chris wrote an article where he asked this question. And I had just come back from teaching in Germany, and this is one of those professional moments where you read something that someone else has written, and I still remember where I was when I read this sentence. It was highlighted, I put it red. I mean, I did everything I could because I thought, this is exactly what I want to do. And the question is, can one recapture the experiential history of these killers? The choices they faced, the emotions they felt, the coping mechanisms they employed, the changes they underwent. And that really is the heart of the research I do. Can you step into the shoes of a perpetrator to understand what choices did he think he had? I really don't care about the choices you think he had or the choices I think he had. That's not relevant to his behavior. What's relevant to his or her behavior is, what choices did he think he had at the time of the killing? What emotions did he feel? What coping mechanisms did she employ? When someone's killed like this, how do they sleep at night? How do they go back and hug their own children? How do they go back and see their spouse? How do they cope with what they've done? And then most fundamentally, what changes do they undergo? Because for me, this is a process of transformation by which ordinary people become capable of this extraordinary evil. Now, if this is a research question, we want to step into the shoes, the experiential history of a perpetrator. What risks do we run in doing that? What's the risk of this question? I'm sorry? Sympathy. What else? Yes? Yeah, both of these are great answers. Sympathy. You're okay with what they did. It becomes, excuse me, unapologetic. It's exculpatory. By understanding their behavior, it somehow makes the behavior okay. And that's what we have to, I'm going to come back to this at the end. We have to be careful of that. And it certainly is there. When you step into the shoes and understand the world from how they saw it, you may start to have some sympathy, maybe even some empathy for how they came to do what they did. But if we make the other decision and we say, this question's too dangerous to even ask. Bruno Bettelheim's a famous survivor of the Holocaust, whose life story of survival I certainly respect tremendously, although I disagree with him very much on this point. Bettelheim says, you don't even ask this question. This question's too painful. It's too touchy. You simply turn your eyes away from that evil, because no good can come of asking this question. I would say there's actually some danger that can come from not asking it. What is that? If we don't ask this question, what risk do we run? Yes? Good. We dehumanize them. We see them as separate from the rest of humanity. And why is that a problem, Nick? Good. I'm so glad you have that book rather than that stupid Brad, whoever that was. But this is a problem, is it doesn't help us understand. We don't understand what it says about other people around us and about ourselves. And we also don't understand how to prevent it. I mean, if we're not going to try and understand the reasons that people come to do this evil, we have no hope of trying to stop this or prevent it. So I'm going to take this risk. I'd rather risk trying to understand it and all the things that go with that than risk turning my back from it and having no understanding of how people come to do this evil. So, what we want to look at is how have people historically tried to explain this reality of ordinary people committing this type of evil? And some people have focused very much on the extraordinary origins of this. They've said that whenever groups of people come together, horrible things happen. And you've been part of groups, and you know that sometimes you've been part of a group where some nasty things happen. I don't know how much you hear about national news, but in October, I was in Poland. I had nothing to do with it, but while I was away in Poland, we had our annual pumpkin festival in Keene. This is a big deal for a city of 20,000 people. Every October, we carve and light, maybe it's because we have nothing better to do, we carve and light about 30,000 pumpkins by hand. And our whole downtown turns into this beautiful pumpkin festival. We hold the world's record of pumpkins carved by hand and lit at the same time. It's a great thing. October wasn't a great thing. Our students got a little bit out of hand at the college, fueled by other students from other colleges and communities elsewhere, and we had riots there. It wasn't our best day by far, and we're still trying to heal and reconnect with some members of the community who we've alienated, justifiably, certainly in their mind, alienated. Groups of people came together there and did some pretty nasty things. But I think it's a mistake to say that whenever groups come together, bad things happen. You've been part of groups, and our alliance here is one example of a group of people come together and do some incredible good, do some great things. I think what groups do is what this microphone is doing. This microphone amplifies my voice. It doesn't change my voice, it just amplifies it. It exaggerates it. I think groups do that. You bring together a group of individuals, the group's not going to be different from the individuals involved, but it's going to amplify the tendencies of the individuals involved. You bring together a group of nasty people, the group's going to be capable of some pretty nasty stuff. But you bring together a group of good people, and that group can do some incredible good. So I want to be careful about how we talk about the group dynamics. I also want to be careful about ideology. Many people point to this and say, well, obviously perpetrators do what they do because of what they believe, their ideology, their worldview. And especially when you study the Holocaust, this is pushed quite a bit. It's the ideology of perpetrators that matters so much here. And again, I want to be careful. Ideology is important in understanding perpetrator behavior, but I don't think it's the only piece that's important. I just think it's one piece of it. I think two things we have to be careful with about ideology is we're used to thinking that what you believe drives how you behave. But one of the truisms of social psychology is how you behave can also affect how you believe. And probably the best example we have in American history is a relationship between racism and slavery. People assumed for decades that we were racist, and it was the racism that drove the economic system of slavery. I think, though, now today, American historians are pretty much of one voice in saying that relationship was actually backwards. It was an economic system of exploitation that slavery was that needed racism. Why? Justify it. Yeah, to give it a reason, to make it okay. So here the behavior led to the ideology. And the second thing we have to be careful about with ideology is that not all perpetrators are committed ideologues. I would say the minority, clear minority, of perpetrators I've sat with and interviewed face-to-face are committed ideologues. Most of them are motivated by other things, like greed and opportunism, the chance to get someone's goat, someone's radio, someone's home, someone's sheet metal roofing, someone's land. Those aren't ideologies. Those are issues of greed and opportunism. So I want to be careful about saying ideology is the complete and only explanation we need here, because I don't think it's that. I think the other thing people often look at is certainly the people who perpetrate these atrocities, as you said at the beginning, must be pathological. They must be mentally ill. They must be twisted in some way. So let's look at the first of these, Andrew, on the Mad Nazi thesis. This is the idea that perpetrators do suffer from some form of pathology, and this is why they do what they do. They're crazy, they're mentally ill, they're lunatics. And we actually had a chance to test this at Nuremberg in 1945-46. 22 Nazi leaders tried at Nuremberg. One, Robert Ley, commits suicide, so we have 21 still on trial. And during the trial, a psychologist and psychiatrist, Douglas Kelly and Gustav Gilbert, have a chance to actually roam the halls of the Nuremberg jail cells and give intelligence, IQ tests, and personality tests, the Rorschach, to the Nuremberg defendants. So let's talk about the results of both of these. First, the IQ test. The average IQ is what? Do you know? It's 100. It's how it's normed. If you graduate from college, your IQ is around 110. If you have a Ph.D., average IQ is around 120. I have a Ph.D., I work with PhDs. Nothing about that is true. I think average IQ of PhDs is like 80, but it's supposed to be 120. So we give these tests to the Nazis, and what do you think we're hoping to see in their intelligence? Low. Why? Okay, I'm sorry. All I heard there was just a jumble of stuff, and I'm tired, and it may be that. What did you say? They should be smart enough to know better. If evil is done by stupid people, we can fix stupid, okay? We can educate people and make them smarter, and smart people should theoretically do good things. What did the IQ test in Nuremberg find? These defendants were scoring 120, 130, a few into the genius level of 140s or higher. These men were bright. They were not average intelligence. They were above average intelligence. They were very bright, and that was a little bit difficult for the world to adjust to because it had been so much easier if they had been stupid because, again, we can fix that. We can educate evil out of people. The fact that they were this smart was problematic. But really problematic was the result of the Rorschach test. If we can see the next slide. This is the Rorschach test. It's a series of ink blots. People always make fun of it on television and other places, but it's the most commonly used psychological test still today. It has been for close to 80 years. Very popular test of pathology. You're given this ink blot. You're asked, what do you see in this? And then someone with training in it is going to analyze your responses. We still have the responses all the Nuremberg defendants gave to these Rorschach. So it seems like every 5 years, someone publishes another book reanalyzing the Nuremberg Rorschachs, and we pretty much always end up with the same results. What are we hoping to see from the Rorschachs? They're crazy. They suffer from pathology. What do we end up seeing from the Rorschachs? Yeah, perfectly normal, mentally healthy. Only one of them tested as abnormal on the Rorschachs, and his name was Julius Streicher. What do you know about Julius Streicher? Who was he? He's the editor of Der Stürmer, the notorious Nazi anti-Semitic newspaper. And here's all you need to know about Streicher is before the trial starts, the other Nuremberg defendants, the other Nazis, go to their general counsel and they say, we know we're going to be tried. And, we'll do our best on this and we know it's going to happen, but we don't want to be tried with Streicher. When a Nazi says about you, you're so far gone they don't want to be tried with you, you're pretty far gone because that's a low bar, right? So even his other colleagues knew Streicher was crazy. But everyone else at Nuremberg tested well within the bounds of normality. Now, these men were architects of genocide. They weren't rank-and-file killers. But in a major trial of rank-and-file killers in Copenhagen the following year, same two tests given to those rank-and-file killers, same results. Bright guys, well-educated guys, many of them. All of them tested well within the bounds of normality. We've seen similar tests in Rwanda, have the same similar conclusions to them. So what it leads us to is another possibility that if they're not mad Nazis, if they're not crazy, maybe they're just twisted. Maybe they're messed up, their personality's bad, or something happened to them as children, whatever. And this is a more complex one. I'll be honest with you, I forget the chapter number where I even talk about the bad Nazi thesis, but when I wrote it, my wife would tell you, I started bringing a pillow to the office because as I wrote this chapter, I was boring myself as I wrote it. When you read it, it's a terribly boring section of the book, and I apologize ahead of time. So I'm going to make the long story very, very short. Is as much as we've searched for the so-called Nazi personality, and people have searched for this high and low, as much as we've searched for it, starting with the work of a team of researchers at Cal Berkeley, we just haven't found it. We just don't have the empirical evidence that suggests there's any set of personality traits or any set of personality clusters that are predictive of who commits atrocities like this and who doesn't commit these atrocities. So what it leaves us with is my central argument, which is it's ordinary people like you and me who commit genocide, mass killing. I like W.H. Auden's quote here. Evil is unspectacular and always human. He's not talking about the consequences of evil. When this evil is done, consequences are absolutely spectacular in the worst meaning of the word. He's talking about the origins of it. The origins of evil are unspectacular, and most importantly, they're always human. I would say in the perpetrators I've interviewed over the years, I can count on one hand the number that I simply couldn't make a human connection with. That I sat with, and when it was all over, I thought, I guess you did sit in the presence of evil. That felt like there was no connection there to be made. Not that I'm seeking to find connections, but there was nothing human that seemed to be possible in that encounter. The vast majority of the dozens and dozens and dozens of other people I've sat with who've committed these atrocities, including the man who committed the atrocities we started the lecture with, absolutely something unspectacular and very human about them. Why is this argument that's ordinary people like you and me who commit this evil, why is this argument so difficult to understand, to absorb, to admit? What's so hard about it? Yes? We don't want to think that anyone's capable of doing such atrocities. So we don't want to look around us and go, wow, it could be that other people in this room could do something like this. I mean, very often at this point, you'll start to see people cross their arms and look at someone next to them and go, you know, now that you mention this stuff, this person is a little sketchy. I could definitely see some people in this room doing some of these things. But what's the other piece that's difficult? Yes? Yeah. Good. Yeah, that's the more difficult piece. I mean, it's fine, and you see people sometimes enter the discussion this way to say, yeah, I could certainly see other people doing this, and this is insightful. But the really insightful piece is, what does it raise about you, about yourself and your own capacities here? I've always said that if the book had never sold a single copy and no one outside of my mother had ever said anything good about the book, I still would have been glad I wrote it because of what I learned about myself in the process of writing it. And I think when you think about the questions of human nature and who we are and what we're capable of, there's some insights we can get here that come from understanding other people's capabilities, but also come from understanding, seeing our own capabilities as well. Steven Pinker's a psychologist at Harvard who says, educated people hold truth in esteem. You value truth. In the process of becoming educated, truth is a good thing. You hold that in esteem. But it doesn't mean that every truth you're faced with makes you feel good about who you are and makes you feel good about the world you live in. Sometimes you're faced with a truth that isn't very flattering, that doesn't make you feel very good. Does that make it any less true? No. Just because it doesn't make you feel good doesn't make it less true. It can still be truth. And I think this is one of those truths that we have to face, is the capacity of people like you and I, including ourselves, to commit these type of atrocities. Here are a couple of quotes that illustrate this as well. This is Tina Rosenberg, a journalist who's written about violent criminals in Latin America. I would have preferred them to be monsters. Coming to understand that this was not the case was disturbing. For what it taught me about these people and ultimately about myself, I did not want to think that many of the violent are people like us, so civilized, so educated, so cultured, and because of that, so terrifying. I love the last part of her quote here. It's not that terrifying if we say these perpetrators are unlike anyone we know. If they're just out there, it's not terribly terrifying. What's terrifying is they're educated, they're cultured, they're civilized, they're like us, and because of that, that's what we find so terrifying. Daniel Farstein is an Argentine academic who says a metaphysical category of absolute evil is distracting in many ways, leaves us safe from the distress that might be caused by examining the genocidal potential latent in every modern society and all its members. The potential's there everywhere. It's there in all of us, and it's there in every society. 194 nations in the country. We're going to look in a few moments at the 25 nations that are at risk for genocide. That's not even the best way to say it, though. Every nation's at risk for genocide. They're simply at different levels of risk. Every one of us is at risk of heart attack. Excuse me. Some of us at greater risk than others. So every society has this potential within it. And I think sometimes this is frustrating to us. We actually had a U.S. government official we were working with at the Auschwitz Institute I worked with a couple of years ago. And we were trying to get this official, who was in a pretty strategic position in the U.S. State Department, to come to Poland for a week to study issues of genocide prevention with us. And we've educated about 250 government officials from around the world, over 65 countries. We've brought representatives of their government to Auschwitz for a week, where they've studied with us what genocide is, what the warning signs are, and what they can do to make a difference in the face of genocide. And this high-ranking U.S. state official actually said to me, you know, we understand, genocide's a concern, it's a foreign policy issue, but as a democracy, it's not something our country would ever do or ever go through. And I thought, that's just odd. It's discouraging that you're in the position you are in government and you live in a country founded on the twin evils of genocide and slavery. And you can say to me, we live in a country that nothing like this would ever happen. This country's here because something like this happened, in large part. And you're in this position in the State Department, and you can't even recognize that piece. Latent in every society and all of its members. Another quote from Manis Midlarsky. We do far better to explain their descent into atrocity as human beings than as some mutated creatures whose behaviors defy understanding. In the latter instance, we claim no purchase on explanation and possible prevention, whereas in the former, we may find some hope from the future. And then finally, from Jan Hatzfeld, a French journalist. Hatzfeld, when I'm in Rwanda and I interview perpetrators, it's not true any longer because most have been released, but most of the time they were in prison. Hatzfeld worked in a different prison in Rwanda, interviewing perpetrators. Interviewed this one man who tried to be honest with the court. When the court said, how many people did you kill in the genocide? The man really tried to be honest, and he finally had to say, judges, your honors, I can't tell you a number. I just can't, I didn't keep track. He said, for close to 100 days, I woke up in the morning, my wife fed me breakfast, I sharpened my machete, I'd go out into the swamps, and I'd find a Tutsi hiding in the swamp. I'd pull them out, and I'd hack their Achilles tendon on one leg so they couldn't run, they couldn't leave. I'd go back in the swamp, I'd get another one, do the same. I'd go back and get another, do the same. When I had 5 or 6, I'd come back, and sometimes I'd rape, but always I'd kill. My wife would come down, and she would strip the corpses of their clothing. She'd take whatever the people had and take it back to the house. I'd go back in the swamp. I'd do it again. I'd come home at night. We had a dinner. I slept. And the next day, I'd do the same thing for almost 100 days. And he said, honestly, I can't tell you how many people I killed. Hatzfeld's interview with him, this perpetrator says this, at the time of those murders, I didn't even notice the tiny thing that would change me into a killer. If you ask me just very simply, what do I spend my professional career in this particular section of the field doing, It is trying to understand and find the tiny things that transform someone into a killer. What are those pieces? What are those little pieces of the puzzle that help me understand how a church-going father, husband, school teacher becomes capable of committing those atrocities that he committed in Tarama? So the model I developed, if you read the book, looks something like this. Let's just take these tiny things, group by group by group, 3 groups. So the first group, next slide, Andrew, is cultural construction of worldview. One of the things I wanted to look at when I start to understand these tiny things is to look at issues of culture that are involved. I think some people who work in this field, in my mind, make the mistake of treating all cultures as the same. And they start then on just looking at perpetrator behavior without looking at everything that surrounds that perpetrator's behavior, as if none of the cultural characteristics matter. I think the cultural characteristics matter. Cultures do differ. So I want to ask the question, what are the cultural characteristics, not that lead to genocide, but that if a genocidal regime comes to power, what is it about the culture that may make it easier to recruit perpetrators from that regime? Some of those cultural characteristics, I think, I'm sorry for the cough, I feel fine. So those of you who are worried about my health right now, you don't need to. It's just 30-some hours of airplane air that have built up. 3 of the cultural characteristics of this. One is, I think cultures differ in how much they value collectivistic characteristics, group identity. So in a culture like ours, it's very individualistic. We meet each other. Immediately we say our name, say, hi, I'm Jim Waller, and you say your name. The individual is who we are. That's our identity. In a country like Rwanda, when you meet someone for the first time, especially in rural Rwanda, it'll be 5 minutes before you get their name. They'll start with grandparents, sometimes great-grandparents, who their fathers and mothers were, where their tribal identity is, what village they're from, what season they were born in, rainy or dry. And then 5 minutes later, if you're still listening, somewhere they'll sneak in their name. That group identity is important. Now, is collectivist group identity a cause of genocide? No. But if someone comes to power and wants to commit genocide, and they want to manipulate those us-them characteristics, those group identity characteristics, and the society already thinks of itself in group dynamic characteristics, that's going to be a little bit easier for them. Authority orientation, social dominance. Cultures differ in how much they value this. In Germany, I was just reading something last night, excuse me, from Hitler's Germany, and just the ways in which authority orientation was valued. Hitler would tell the Hitler Youth, obedience to authority is essential to who we are. It's what must be modeled. It's what you must do. Cambodia, obedience to authority was huge. Rwanda, a culture, deep culture of obedience to authority. In Kinyarwanda, the native Rwandan language, the word for order and law is the same word. I mean, it's just the same thing. So when people give you an order to do something, even if they're not an authority over you, but they just order or strongly request you to do something, the word they'll use for it is the same word they would use if they were trying to describe a law of some type. So again, none of these things are bad in and of themselves, but I think when we look at the culture that perpetrators are drawn from, these are characteristics that can make it a bit easier for a genocidal regime to recruit people into the commission of these type of atrocities. Secondly, is the issue of how victims are described. The psychological construction of the other. I found this fascinating. I go to Bosnia often, but I didn't pick this up until this past week when I was there. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, I don't know if you've studied Bosnia yet. I doubt if you haven't studied Rwanda yet. But in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Dayton Accords in 1995 that end the war basically set up a three-sided government because the 3 identities were Bosniak or Bosnian Muslims, Croats, and Serbs in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So the peace agreement was to say, rather than just vote like a normal democracy would and have one of these 3 groups rise to power, or one person from one of those groups rise to power, every section of government is going to have equal representation. So if you ask who's the president in Bosnia, you've got three answers. One's Bosniak, one's Croat, one's Serb. If you ask, oh, thank you. Sorry, you scared the mud out of me when I was standing there. Now I'm fine, because if you ask who's head of public services, who manages waste in Bosnia and Herzegovina, you've got three people in that office, Bosniak, Croat, Serb. I just learned last week that in the census that was taken 2 years ago, that they still haven't released the reports of, when asked identity, your choices were Bosniak, Croat, Serb, or the other. That was actually an identity category. You can only be a participating part of Bosnian government if you're Bosniak, Croat, or Serb. If you're the other, you can't run for government positions. Jews, Roma, Sinti, immigrants in Bosnia and Herzegovina, they're all the other. When we think about the other in cases of genocide, we're thinking about victims in such a way that they're simply not part of our moral universe. Again, looking from the perpetrator's eyes. If a spider came across here just now, it might bother some of you, but I wouldn't think much about it. If the spider's just coming across, I'd step on it and just keep talking as I'm talking. That spider means nothing to me morally. I know that technically he has relatives, or she has relatives. She has a mother, father spider, brothers, sisters, cousins, and stuff, but I'm not, it just is not part of my moral universe. It doesn't matter to me. Unfortunately for perpetrators, this is the position victims come to occupy. Killing them does not matter to me. They're not part of my moral universe. My moral universe is here. It's with everything within my field of vision. Anything back here that's not my field of vision is not part of my moral universe. One Holocaust perpetrator, I was reading his testimony years later, is asked in trial after the war, how did you come to think it was right to kill Jews? And he said, it wasn't that I thought it was right to kill them. I thought it was wrong if I didn't kill them. Do you see the different morality there? It's not just okay to kill you. I'm actually doing something wrong if I don't kill you. I think for years I struggled with this question of how do perpetrators overcome the moral problem of what they're doing? Before I realized I wasn't asking the right question. I think the key to good research is to ask good questions, and I wasn't there. The right question was more along the lines of, it's not a moral problem. How did it not become a moral problem for them? It's not a moral problem because it's not part of their moral universe. One of the questions I often get is, how do perpetrators turn off their morality when they do this evil? I don't think they turn it off. I think they reorient it. They turn it in a different direction. They look this way and the victims are behind them. Their morality doesn't matter here. Perpetrators are incredibly moral people. And that's an odd thing to hear someone say. If you write it down and take it out of context, it really loses its meaning. But perpetrators are incredibly moral from their understanding of morality. What they're doing is the absolutely moral, just thing to do. So we need to understand, how do you come to that warped moral understanding of the universe? I think they dehumanize their victims. I think they use euphemistic language to cover what they're doing. I think especially we see, to go back in the dehumanization of victims, that the easiest way for me to make you not part of what I care about morally is to strip you of any essence of humanity. So the Einsatzgruppen, with the executions that killed 1.25 million, 1.5 million people in the East, the things that frustrated the Einsatzgruppen to no end was when a victim would turn around and face the executioner. Don't face me. Don't let me see your eyes. Don't let me see your humanity in that way, because for me to do what I have to do, you have to be less than human. Why the numbers? Why the living filth? Why the making of victims into animals, where they look like animals, unclean, unshaven, starving, all of those things. I think all of those things serve as a tool for perpetrators to make it easier for them to do what they have to do. After the war, Franz Stanko was a commandant at Treblinka, and in his trial, there's this dramatic moment where a survivor of Treblinka jumps up in the court, and he says, "Why? You knew Treblinka existed to kill us all. We're going to be dead within 24 hours of arrival. That was the purpose of Treblinka. It was a death camp. Why? Why did you strip us? Why did you beat us? Why did you spit on us? Why did you drag us through the mud? Why did you humiliate us? We were there to be put to death anyway. Why go through all that? And Stengel's response is incredible. Stengel said, because it made it easier for my men to do what they had to do. That's why I let them do those things, because then it was easier to kill you. You were filthy, you were dirty, you were less than human, you were crawling on all fours. It just made it easier for us to do what we had to do. So I think that dehumanization is a big part of the moral reorientation. Blaming the victims for their own suffering is a big piece of this. One of the only two Holocaust perpetrators I had a chance to interview in the early 90s, so this is 45 years after the perpetration, had served his time, brief period of time in Germany, and actually then went back into political office. Served his time as a perpetrator, and we were talking about the time of what he did in the Holocaust, and he said all the right things in terms of it was horrible what we did to the Jews. We should never have done that. It's a shame on our country that we'll always have to bear. Yes, they should get reparations. I'm glad there's a state of Israel. And then at the end of the interview, that word came. And the word was, but. But. You have to remember, he said, and I still remember he moved up to the edge of the seat and he's kind of pointing my face. He said, but you have to remember, the Jews were going to take over the world. If we didn't stop them, they were going to take over the world. And so even though he'd said all the right things, 45 years later, he's still justifying part of what he did by blaming the victims. He didn't say it, but what was implied was, you should thank us, because if we hadn't done this, the Jews would have taken over the world, because that's the direction it was going. So the blaming the victim piece, I think all of this goes into a construction of the other that makes it easier for perpetrators to commit these atrocities. And then finally is the social construction of cruelty. This is in reference to the reality that genocide like this is done by groups of people. Genocide doesn't happen because one person goes out and goes on a killing spree. That's what we have CSI shows for. Genocide happens because large groups of people come together to kill other large groups of people, large numbers over an extended period of time. So the group dynamics here are important. And what I want you to do is kind of visualize a large basket here. In this basket, we can put the things that affect your behavior in normal groups you're a part of. So think of groups: athletic teams, drama troupes, choirs, classes, fraternities, sororities. What are groups you're a part of? What are some of the things that affect your behavior in that group? And let's put in that basket. What are some of those things? Yes? The setting. What else? Good. Setting, mood, atmosphere. Yes? Behavior of other people in the group. The hierarchy, your place within the hierarchy. You guys are on fire. Your place within the hierarchy in the group. Yes? Peer pressure, conformity. Sorry? The value system of other people in the group. So all of the, Andrew? Camaraderie. All of these things we've got in this basket that affect our behavior when we're part of groups we're in. Hopefully for good. Sometimes it has some negative impacts. Let's pick that basket up, and let's bring that basket of things over here to a group of perpetrators. The challenge here is to say, what perpetrators do is completely different from what you're doing. These people are killing other people. That's their group activity. But all the things in this basket, atmosphere, mood, hierarchy, camaraderie, peer pressure, conformity, all of these things, that's what affects these perpetrators as well. I mean, it's the same stuff. What they do is different, but the group dynamics of how they're socialized to do it, how they identify with the group and turn off their conscience because they take on the group conscience. All the things that bind them to a group, those things work for perpetrators too. Again, what they do is different, but the group dynamic piece, I think, is very similar. For a long time, for instance, just to give you one example, I struggled with the question of brutality. Why, in perpetrator behavior, do we see just cases of extraordinary brutality? I mean, the killing is the killing. But why do you in the Holocaust begin to throw babies up and catch them on bayonets? Why do you, I use this example sometimes and I ask people, where do you think this comes from? And they often guess the Holocaust, where perpetrators kill and rape women and then cut out the woman's vagina as a trophy. Or they kill men and they sever the testicles of the man, empty it, dry the testicles out, sew it together as a tobacco pouch, use it as a trophy. Both of those examples actually are U.S. cavalry treatment of Native Americans in the mid to late 1800s. The brutality, the creativity, where does that come from? I think it comes from these similar group dynamics. When you're part of a group, you want to be good at what the group does, right? You want to be creative. You want to stand out in the group by your performance in the group. Again, I think perpetrator group dynamics are real similar. Once you've chosen to become part of a group of killers, you know, at the beginning in Rwanda, people would have to have blood on their machete to become part of the group. And I've talked with perpetrators who cut themselves and then came in and said, here's the blood, I'm part of the group. But eventually they killed. And as they killed and they became a deeper part of the group and the camaraderie that develops, they wanted to be good. They wanted to be good at what the group did. What the group happened to do was kill. And so I think these group dynamics are very similar to the group dynamics that impact you and I. Next slide, please. So what I've asked you, two more here, Andrew, just on this one more, thanks, is I've asked you in the brief time we've had together to really make an explanatory shift of some type, to move away from internal, dispositional, personality characteristics, thinking of monstrous people that we demonize. I've asked you to move a little, and it's what I ask readers of the book to do, to think more externally, more situationally, more social psychologically, to think of conducive social conditions rather than personality characteristics, to humanize rather than dehumanize. And again, you ultimately make this choice. You're adults. If you want to dehumanize perpetrators and say that it's easier for you to live your life by thinking of perpetrators as demonic lunatics, incredibly different from us, you'll choose to do so. But I've asked you not to do to perpetrators what they do to their victims. They dehumanize their victims. In an uncomfortable way, I've asked you to humanize perpetrators. Not to forgive, not to forget, not to apologize, but simply to understand. On the next slide, you'll see a quote here from Martha Minow of Harvard, a legal scholar. The response to mass atrocities should resist the temptation to dehumanize perpetrators and instead seek to confirm the humanity of everyone. But, here's a big but, affirming humanity, common humanity, does not mean turning the other cheek or forgetting what happened. In other words, we can hold on to both of these things. We can siege, that's not even a Bosnian word. We can seek and pursue understanding and at the same time hold on to moral and legal accountability. Simply because I understand the reason someone did this behavior doesn't make the behavior right, doesn't forgive them, doesn't excuse them on any legal grounds. We've simply tried to understand something with the goal of, if we can understand it, maybe we can start to understand how to prevent it. Why is hate speech so important to prevent? It's important to prevent because hate speech is one of the ways we construct the other. And if we let it go without checking it, constructing the other in that way can dehumanize people to such a degree that their murder doesn't really matter. It's not a moral question to us. So why does this matter? I think it matters because we want to facilitate prevention and intervention. Again, because something's reprehensible doesn't mean it's incomprehensible. Sometimes I think people make that mistake, that this is so horrific, it can't be understood. What I've tried to say to you is that the most horrific things beg to have the greatest understanding. Because if we don't understand them, we can't have any hope of preventing them. And I think when we know the needs that perpetrator behavior is feeling, I do very much believe that when people engage in behaviors They do so because it's filling a need. It may look ridiculous to us, what someone's doing, but for them, it's filling some need. If we understand the needs that perpetrator behavior fills, I think we can think more creatively together about finding other ways to fulfill those needs that don't involve the destruction of other humans. And then finally, the last thing I'll say, sorry, two last things I'll say. One is this matters because we still live in a world in which genocide is a real concern, obviously, for the 21st century. I think genocide, and I don't think this is an outlandish statement at all, is the single pressing, greatest human rights problem in the world today. We have a lot of human rights problems. Human trafficking, child labor, sexual exploitation across the globe. But I think in terms of human cost and destruction of lives, I think genocide is still the most pressing human rights problem we face. This is a forecasting model from University of Sydney that was done in 2011 to forecast out at-risk countries over the next 5 years. And you see the number of countries on this model. Some of these countries have stabilized and aren't as much at risk as they used to be. Some of them, like Syria and Central African Republic, have gone up in flames. There are some countries on here that aren't on this model, aren't on this list, that have gone up in flames. But all we're saying here is that there are, I'm going to get the water in just a second. There are 20 to 25 countries in the world where the risk, if you think of risk like firewood, the risk is stacked. The firewood is stacked. They've got rough economies, they've got poor governance, they've got a history of conflict, they've got social fragmentation, the wood's stacked. And what we live in fear of is there's going to be a match to light the wood afire. And if that match happens, as it happened in Central African Republic, December 2013, if that match happens, as it happened in Syria 4 years ago, the wood's there, and it's going to go up, and it's going to go up in blazes, and those blazes will take hundreds and thousands, perhaps even millions of lives. So these questions matter to us, and this course matters to you. I'm going to say it's probably the most important course you'll take here during your time at Sonoma State, because you live in a world that still seems intent on tearing itself apart. So finally, and then I'll take your questions. What can you do? Arthur Ashe is a famous U.S. tennis player, the first great African-American tennis player. He was a famous civil rights activist, famous AIDS activist, because later in his life, Ashe contracted AIDS through a blood transfusion at a Richmond, Virginia hospital. And Ashe was once asked in a lecture, how do you address these things? Civil rights, AIDS, does anything matter? And Ashe gave this beautiful 3-sentence response. He said, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. If you were to ask me today, what do you do to make a difference in the face of a world that's torn apart by genocide? I can't give you any better response than Ashe gave. Start where you are. Don't wait until you have a degree. You don't need a degree to do it. You don't need to be a college professor to do it. You don't need to be employed somewhere to do it. You don't need to live in a certain place to do it. Start where you are. It's what Robert Harris did, right? Started where he was. Use what you have. Do what you can. Whatever you have can make a unique contribution to it. Whatever you do can make a unique contribution to it. This is a human problem. It's got a human solution. There is nothing too small that you can do to make a difference here. Even if it's just leaving today and sending a text or a tweet to someone about something you learned today, something you heard in conversation, something you've learned in this class over the course of the semester, those things can have incredible snowball effects that end up making a tremendous amount of difference in a world that's incredibly hurting, in a world where people still seem intent on trying to tear apart the very fabric of the things that should hold us together. So I want to close here today with, again, just Ashe's admonition. Start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. There's nothing too small that you could do here to make a difference in the face of all you've learned over the course of the semester. We have a few minutes left to take a couple of questions that you might have, things that people want to ask or comments you want to make. Yes, sir? Oh, God, I was hoping to get water, and now I can't get... The question was, where do I see ISIS with this? I think when we talk about mass atrocity, The three crimes under the umbrella of mass atrocity: war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. So sometimes we wait because we think genocide is the worst crime. I think ISIS from its inception has been committing crimes against humanity across the region, almost across the globe. I think last week the United Nations issued a report in which they've said that some of the crimes ISIS has committed amount to the crime of genocide. Now that shouldn't matter. If you're suffering somewhere, whether someone calls a crime against humanity or genocide or a war crime, you're still suffering. But what ISIS is doing for us is it's pushing the standard model of genocide studies has been state-sponsored violence. ISIS is challenging that, and ISIS is saying it's not a state, technically, not how we define a nation state in political science. ISIS is pushing us in a different direction to say, this type of violence and terrorism isn't always state-sponsored. Sometimes it's anti-state, sometimes it's independently organized episodes of violence as well. So are we going to respond differently now because we can say ISIS is also committing genocide than we would have 2 weeks ago when we'd simply say they were committing crimes against humanity? I don't know if it's going to lead to a different response, but people's reaction to the word genocide tends to be deeper than the reaction to other crimes of atrocity. So it'll be interesting to see how the world reacts to the UN report. But again, ISIS is changing the boundaries for us because it's not a state sponsoring genocide. It's an independent, non-state actor that's showing it has the potential to kill large numbers of people over an extended period of time for reasons that are very genocidal in nature. That's a great question. Yes? Oh, thanks. Did everybody hear her? If you didn't get a chance to hear her, it was a great lecture. Good. What's the percentage of women versus men in taking part? This is a great question because you have to define what taking part or perpetration means. If you're thinking about women in the supportive roles, like the example I gave at the beginning, the woman who feeds her husband breakfast and dinner and helps get the clothes off the victims and so on, you have large numbers of women participating in this. If you think of the front lines, though, forms of killing, you do tend to see very high, disproportionately high number of male perpetrators involved in killing. Now the question, though, is do we not see as many female perpetrators? It seems to me there are two options. One would be you could say we don't see as many female perpetrators because females, by their own nature, don't have the ability to kill. It's just not within feminine nature to be as violent as it is for men. Or is the other option that genocide happens in very patriarchal, male-dominated societies typically, and women just don't have the opportunity to kill like men have the opportunity to kill. And for me, I've come down on that second issue. I don't think there's anything uniquely feminine about female nature that makes them less capable of violence. I think the issue is an issue of human nature, and when given the opportunity, females engage in very similar levels of violence as males. Holocaust survivors told us this for decades. You read Holocaust testimonies from people who survived concentration camps, they'll say, yeah, the female guards were horrible. They were worse in some ways than male guards. But we always just kept putting that off out there because it didn't fit our conception of who females were. But I think Wendy Lauer's recently written a book called Hitler's Furies, where she looks at female perpetrators in Nazi Germany. And I think Wendy comes to the same conclusion. When given the opportunity, females step up or step down, whatever your perspective is, to the type of atrocities that males are capable of committing. Yes? Matriarchal communities? Yeah, there's so few, it's kind of hard to test that. You know, the interesting test, and you should ask Ambassador Mathilde when she's here with you in a couple of weeks, is there's only one country in the world that has a female-dominated parliament, and that country is Rwanda. 64% of Rwanda's elected parliament is female. I think Rwanda is kind of banking to some degree that female leadership at those highest levels will make a difference. Now, Rwandans, though, will always say to you, also say to you, I think, and I don't know if it's something the ambassador would say in public, but I think Rwandan citizens would say to you, it still is a very male-dominated society. I mean, we have high numbers in parliament, and I've been in Rwanda enough that I would still say it's still a very male-dominated society. So that's where it's going to get hard to kind of estimate. It's a good question, though. Yes? Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And I think it's that moral universe piece is not all or none, either or. I think they were certainly within his universe enough to educate them. But let me tell you another piece of his story. He had grown up with a mother who was so afraid of the Tutsi that every night before he went to bed, his mother made him go in the back to where they, basically the root cellar, where they kept some of their vegetables. And she said, please go back there and make sure there are no Tutsi hiding in the back. And then he'd come back in and she'd say, please go to every room and look under the beds and make sure there are no Tutsi hiding here. She lived in that fear that many Rwandans lived in, which was a real fear, that Tutsi were going to come back from Uganda or Burundi or somewhere and take over Rwanda. So when it happened in 1990, and a Tutsi rebel force came from Uganda to try and take over Rwanda again and were repelled, that affirmed her fears. So he grew up in that. I think he found a way to educate Tutsi children, but when the killing broke out, and he's hearing on the radio and from his church leaders and everyone else that the Tutsi are a real threat to us, that's what they've been his whole life. And I think for him, it was a very thin layer of moral commitment to Tutsi that he could teach them. But once you peeled that back, they were the threat. And for him, committing the atrocities he committed made sense to him because they were such a threat. It's a great question. One or two more, yes. There and then there. We'll do three more, yes. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Go. So Bob Simon did a story on Hassan Nohanovic at some point. Oh, fascinating. Part of a story. Oh, it's part of the story on Bob Simon, you're saying. Yeah. Oh, fascinating. I appreciate that. Hassan didn't mention that to me, and I'll look that up. But again, Hassan's story is incredible because it hasn't made international news like you would think, but he basically has brought the UN to justice for the murder of his parents and his brother. And again, what's just remarkable to me about Hassan is just that, and someone asked him, he did a presentation for us last week, and one of the first questions was, do you have any sense of satisfaction from the UN judgment? And Hassan, who just always has a furrowed brow and he's always blinking his eyes, and I think those are just nervous habits he's developed, said, no, I still don't have a mother, father, or brother. And so it really didn't. He spent a ton of money, a ton of time, but it really hasn't brought back that satisfaction. But it's just, there are times you're with someone where you're just reminded of just the legacy of what this thing is. I'll give you one more example, then we'll get to our final two questions. I was in Vancouver, British Columbia, 2 years ago, speaking to a group of about 800 high school students as part of a program. I did my talk. A Holocaust survivor from Hungary did his talk. He was a child survivor. And then they put us up together on a panel to get questions from the students. And the child survivor from Hungary was a big guy. He immigrated to Canada as an orphan, and he had protected himself. His coping mechanism was he became a boxer. He was a fairly well-known boxer in Canada, and he still boxed every day. I mean, he could have killed me if he'd wanted to. He still every day was working out, did CrossFit, incredible shape. But the first question he gets from the high schoolers, it's an odd question, but the high school audience is trying to find something to hold on to here. They've heard this stuff for a day and they just don't know what to grab. And so a student stands up, very brave, in front of hundreds of other students and says to him, what was your favorite childhood memory? And you think, well, that's a weird question. But what they're trying to do is they want something to hold on to. And he waited, and it was probably, I've looked back at the tape, I think it was about 30 seconds. It felt like 4 hours, because we're sitting up there together, and he's just quiet. He doesn't say anything. He's not prone to the dramatic. And then he just leans up to the microphone, and he says, I don't have one. And he sits back. And then I take the next question. That's ridiculous. I mean, I don't even know what the next question was. I'm supposed to come up with some response to whatever someone asks next. But again, it reminded me, this is the legacy. Here's someone who survived, but he's asked a simple question. What's your favorite childhood memory? And some of you have had rough childhoods here, but you probably have something you can bring back. And he wasn't being dramatic. He was just being honest. He just said, I don't have one. And he just sat back. I mean, that's the thing I think we're called to. Our mandate is we shouldn't have to live in a world where a child has to say something like that, where a child can't have that type of memory they can pull back. 2 questions. One was here, and then one was here, I believe. Yes? Uh-huh. Mhm. Mhm. No, it's a great question. I mean, technology is a two-sided sword on this one. It can absolutely be used the way you described. To mobilize people now to kill and to get information out about where the victims are is much easier than it's ever been at any point in human history. But also to mobilize people for protest, to mobilize people for resistance, those things technology gives us an edge for that we've never had in human history. And just an example I'll give you quickly. Kenya in 2008, after the presidential elections, had some pretty significant levels of violence that threatened to become possibly genocidal, but international intervention helped pull them back from the brink. 2013, Kenya went through its next presidential elections, and we, the world, harnessed the technology in Kenya, which most every Kenyan has, which is a cell phone. They harnessed that technology, and they simply developed a platform where any Kenyan, anywhere in the country, when he or she saw violence breaking out on their street, or they tried to go vote somewhere and couldn't vote, they just were able to text the information in somewhere, and immediately we could track in real time where violence was happening, where sketchy things were happening. People could upload video to this platform of things that were going on, and immediately international observers could go to these places and stop the violence in its tracks. So technology absolutely has a downside here in terms of what it can mobilize, but I think it also has a tremendous upside in terms of what it can mobilize, and if we can focus our energies on that piece of it, we'll certainly be better off than the other. Great question. Final question, a lot of pressure. It's the last question. It's going to have to be a good question because this has been a great day. You guys have done great. I'm very proud of you. It's been a great day. So now, yes. Good. Look at you guys today. You're amazing today. Our question is, it's happened so much. It continues to happen so much. Is it inevitable? Can we do anything to prevent it? I think on one hand, excuse me, you do feel like it's inevitable, it's ubiquitous. We keep growing in population. As we grow in population, resources become more scarce. So it does seem like it's always there, it's always ever present. And I think a pessimist could easily say, we're always going to have this with us. We just maybe best we can do is structure our society so it doesn't happen here. But I think more optimistically we can say, this thing doesn't have to happen. That's what I keep going back to. This isn't a problem that some extraterrestrial group has come down and inflicted on us. This is a human problem. We choose to do this to each other. As a human problem, it has to have a human solution. We don't have to keep doing this. There are other alternatives to solve political disputes. There are other alternatives to solve land disputes. There are other alternatives to solve identity disputes. We have to make it so costly to a regime that wants to commit genocide, we have to make that so costly to them that they realize they have to solve whatever issue they have going on has to be solved in a different way. Can we do that? Absolutely. Do we want to do it? Do we care enough to push the United Nations, which is a collection of member states, to do that? I think that's what seems to be our difficulty. If it happens to us or close to us, we care enough. When it happens on the other side of the world to a country we've never heard of, we don't seem to care enough. But what we're seeing now, and it ties us back to the first question about ISIS, you let these things go on somewhere in a part of the world you don't know anything about, never heard of, they don't stay there. They go elsewhere. These things become a global problem. So I think we can do it. I think we have to do it. I don't think it has to be a continuing feature of the human condition. We can rise above this. We're not a slave to this history. We're not a slave to the forecast. We can do something different. We have to have the will to do it. And I think if we place that will in the right places, yeah, I absolutely think we can make a difference. Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much.